Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the artist of comics like Newburn, That Texas Blood, and the Enfield Gang Massacre. It's Jacob Phillips. Thanks for coming on, Jacob.
Thank you for having me.
So we are recording this on Monday, April 15th, and it's the morning in Alaska and the late afternoon where you're located. How's the day treated you so far?
Yeah, good. I've just got home from the studio, finished a bit early, so that was nice. Just been working, penciling some pages, doing a bit of Patreon stuff, keeping some plates spinning.
I know that all too well. I actually have to ask you a really quick question about your studio. Do you really have an upcycled shipping container in Manchester you work out of?
Not anymore. I used to. I moved about a year ago. I upgraded. As cool as that was, it was like, it became just impossible to work out of because it was, in the summer, it's unbearably hot. It had a glass front on it and like no insulation. So it was like unbearably hot in the summer. And in the winter, if you had the heater on, it would collect condensation and it would drip everywhere. So it was like dripping on my drawing board, dripping on my computer. So I was like, no, need to make a move.
Comic art and electronics famously love condensation. So that seems like it would have been a really great combination.
Yeah, so I've got a new space now, actually slightly closer to home. So it's worked out quite well and bigger and not dripping, which is the main bit.
I have to admit, when I saw that in an interview, I think it was with Fanbase Press that you had done. And when I saw that, I was like, that is a really cool idea. I'm sure that there's some sort of downside, but I love the idea of like reusing shipping containers for like studio space, because I'm sure Manchester is like a lot of places where there's difficulty, like where do you put people to like work and stuff like that in an affordable way. So they're like, let's upcycle shipping containers. Great idea, except for dripping, and it turns into a sauna in the summer.
Yeah, but I was there for I think a good 3 or 4 years, and it was great. You know, it was my first studio out of my house as well, so it was all, I like going out to work.
Yeah,
it was really good, and it served its purpose for a good few years, but it was just time for an upgrade.
So you like having that delineation between your spaces where it's like one thing is home and one thing is work, and never the twain. Well, sometimes the twain shall meet while you are doing a podcast right now in your home.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I much prefer it. It means I can sort of switch off at the end of the day. My girlfriend already hates that I do my emails in bed and in the morning or whatever. And like, this is the room I'm in now is a sort of our shared guest space and workspace and everything. So it's got a laptop and I can do a bit of work here. I've got a little graphics tablet I can work on if I need to, and I've got some comics here and stuff, but it's mostly everything is in the studio. It's pretty good, but it also means any like kind of late nights I can't just dip out and have dinner. I've got to either order into the studio or I need to come home and work from here or whatever. So it has its drawbacks, but I definitely prefer having the different space. And it also means I don't get distracted through the day of like, I need to hoover, I need to do the washing up, I need whatever, what's on TV. I just work.
I was going to say, your first examples were way too responsible. If I was going to be distracted, it'd probably be me playing like Resident Evil 4 or something like that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I don't have the PlayStation at the studio, which is, but I do. I had to stop taking. I have like a little sort of like Game Boy thing which you could just load up like thousands of games onto.
Sure.
And I was taking that into work, playing it on the tram into work, and I've had to stop doing that because I just sit and play Tetris for hours.
God, so convenient, but so distracting. I mean, that is tough. I do have to ask, because you do have that delineated space, obviously there is some kind of infection between the two sides. You bring the Game Boy-like thing, you get distracted, you got to do email in bed, stuff like that. But do you find that having that kind of separated space means that you've had to really have a pretty regimented schedule because you got to stay on task while you're doing it?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Like I know like a lot of comic artists end up working like through the night, and I never really have to do that unless it's a really bad deadline. But I work pretty much 10 till 6-ish kind of every day, which means I can go and run or go to the gym in the morning at a reasonable hour, not have to get up at like 6 a.m. and go. And then I just work until, 5, 6, whenever I get the work done. And that gives me enough time usually to do about 4 pages of either inks or pencils, or like 10 pages of colors if I'm coloring something. Because I work quite fast, I can just sort of get away with working regular hours, and it works nicely for my life outside of work as well.
I imagine so.
It's nice to keep that sort of strict schedule as much as I can. Like, I end up working the odd weekend here and there or late night, but it's compared to a lot of comic artists that I've heard, it's a pretty normal, work schedule. So it's nice.
There's sometimes where I'll get emails from people who are kind of in your neck of the woods where it's like, 8 a.m. Well, no, not 8 a.m. That's too generous. Let's say like 6 a.m. or 6 p.m. Alaska time, which is where I'm at, which is, I think, 3 in the morning there. And it's just like, I know that they're working. And I know a lot of people, a lot of comic artists and a lot of comic creators seem to be kind of night owls. It's interesting. I sometimes wonder if comic creators are night owls because it works best for work or if they're just night owls. I don't know.
Yeah. Because I've obviously had my dad watching him as I grew up doing the same thing. And he's always done it the same way where
he's pretty regimented, right?
Yeah. I think it works for productivity pretty well as well. We're both pretty fast and we both just sort of sit down in the morning and then just work through the day and then go down, finish at the end of the day and that's it. So I've sort of seen that and know that it works. And that's sort of like how that's how I sort of saw it. And that's just how I've worked since. I was living with friends and I live with my girlfriend who all have, regular day jobs.
Right.
It's nice to line up. Yeah. I don't want to be like, right, and now I'm going to go to work when you're clocking off. I like to make it work because, otherwise I'd just be sat around playing PlayStation in the day anyway. I wouldn't be using that day well, so I might as well.
And also, it's like if you were working until like 3 or 4 in the morning and you like wanted to spend time with your girlfriend, you'd be like sleeping during the day when she'd be off. And so it's like there would be complete asymmetry when it comes to your schedules. But I did want to bring up one thing really quick. So you mentioned this. Your dad, for listeners that don't know, is Sean Phillips, as in the rather notable comic artist from Brubaker and Phillips, or Brubaker and Phillips's. I don't know if there's a preference there. But I do think that's one of the interesting things. I made a face when you talked about how your dad is pretty fast and you're pretty fast. I think you're more than pretty fast. Like the fact that you said you could do 4 pages in a day. I don't know where like coloring lies. Like I don't know if 10 pages in a day is fast. It feels fast. But 4 pages in a day, that's pretty good.
Yeah, normally I'd like pencil 4 pages and then the next day I'll ink those 4 pages. And that is usually enough. I can just about do that in a full day. But if I'm not on a tighter deadline, I'll do sort of 3 pages. But compared to other people, I have very, very sparse pages. I know people spend days on a page or whatever, but I don't think I've got the patience or the inclination to do that really. Like I don't, even if I did 1 page a day or 1 page every 2 days, I don't think I'd get any better pages. I think it would just be time spent doing other things. I don't think I would put more time necessarily into the lines on the page. I draw it the way I draw it, and that's just how long it takes. So
I remember talking to Matt Wilson, the colorist, about how like many projects he worked on. I think he found that his sweet spot was like 6 books in a month is where he would probably operate as far as being a colorist. And the thing that he found is that if he did like, let's say he decided he's like, I'm only going to do 2 books this month and just see what happens. He's like, it's going to take me the same amount of time to do the 2 books. I'm not going to do it any better. It's just going to be like what it is. Yeah. And I imagine for you, it's like, it's not that like you're choosing to not be like, I don't know, Jeff Darrow or something like that. It's just your priorities as a storyteller dictates like this is how a page should look. And so that's how you end up doing it.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I don't want to spend hours noodling away on a background. That's just not what I'm into. So it's like, normally I find whatever I'm working on fills the time that in the day, no matter how much it is really. And it always looks the same. So it's it's just how long it takes. So I'm quite fortunate in that I can sort of churn out pages and maybe people don't notice even if I'm like having to do 5 pages in a day because I've got a deadline. Usually people don't tend to notice. It's just I can speed up or I can slow down and it will tend to look just about the same. Whether or not that's a good thing or not, I'm not sure.
I have the weird feeling you've experimented with this.
Not out of choice.
Not out of choice?
It's, like when I was drawing Enfield, it was... when I started issue 1, I thought I had loads of lead time, and it turns out I didn't. So I was basically up against it for 6 months trying to hit each issue. Normally, I would sort of give myself an extra month or 2 months at the start, so I have a bit of time to spill over, and it doesn't matter if I don't hit a monthly deadline. Whereas with Enfield, I didn't have that, so I was drawing sometimes like 30 pages in a month because Chris would do an extra long script, and so I'd have to draw like 6 pages in a day, which is not ideal. Even for someone who draws quite fast, that's not a nice pace to be at.
That's a lot.
Yeah, I think that's probably too many. But I think 4 pages, I'm sort of quite comfortable with that.
Sure. I'm going all over the place already, but that's okay. One of the things I wonder is I'm thinking back to this one panel in that Texas Blood #8. I think it was like a 6-panel grid or something like that. And then like the middle right panel is of Sheriff Joe Bob Coates. And the entire background is pure red. And like,
Yeah.
that's one of the things I think is interesting about this is a lot of people who are line artists are not also their own colorist.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the things that's interesting is like, do you find that you're, going back to the idea that you wouldn't add any more to your pages if you were working slower? Do you think part of the reason why that is because you're also thinking about colors included as you're working?
Yeah, definitely. I think like I don't think I think about it necessarily in the thumbnailing stage. But I will, and I sort of know when I'm going into it, like what needs a background and what doesn't need a background. And then when I get to sort of penciling things, maybe I'll rethink that slightly and I'll be like, okay, this needs more either for, information for the reader or just to balance the page. And then sometimes I'm like, yeah, okay, this is fine. I know that what I'm gonna put in those colors. So a lot of the action panels and stuff like that, I do tend to do like that sort of red, that bright red, or like a shot color in those panels as a background because I feel otherwise it doesn't necessarily need all the other stuff to that's not the focus of the panel. So I think even and same when I'm inking as well, like I know how I'm going to approach the color at least vaguely, so I know that I don't need to put loads of shadow work on it or stuff like that, where I know like I can handle that sort of the modeling and stuff like that is happening in the colors.
Right.
Which obviously, yeah, most artists don't necessarily have. But I think of it sort of as one thing. I do it in stages. I'll pencil, then I'll ink, then I'll color at the end or a few days afterwards. But I know what I'm going to do. So it's like it's just another stage in one process. And it's the same when it comes to lettering as well, because I letter most of my own stuff. That's just another stage in creating that image. So I know when I'm thumbnailing, I know where the lettering's going to go, and then I letter it before I do any drawing, and then I go and build the final panels around the speech bubbles or the caption boxes or whatever's there. So that all works, and then I can ink that, and I know what I'm going to color pretty much to finish it off.
So it's like you have to think about it more holistically because it's not just like you're handing it off to somebody else. You're the person you're handing it off to.
Yeah, exactly. Like I'm just a bit of a control freak maybe, but it's like sometimes when I'm doing books that I'm not lettering myself, it feels strange that even though I put the letters in the thumbnails, I'm not necessarily I'm not doing that stage in the final page. So I'm having to sort of figure out where the dialogue will be going and work around it, but it's not there. So it's like it could be completely wrong, it feels slightly unsettling for me to sort of hand it off to someone else. I know they'll do a good job, they'll make it work, but it's like I feel like maybe I've not left enough space or it's not going to work out like I thought it would, and I feel bad on them for having to figure it out afterwards. But so far it seems to be working, and I don't know what other artists are doing for the letterer as well. So it's like maybe they've got way worse than what I've done. Some people, I guess, don't even think about it at all. At least I'm thinking about it early on.
Would it be difficult for you to just pencil and ink something?
I am doing that at the moment. I'm working on like a short story, which I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about yet, but Chris has written it again. I'm penciling and inking it, but I'm not coloring it. The colorist is Pip Martin, who flats all my colors normally.
Mm-hmm.
And she's done a few different things. She colored a pin-up in Enfield. She colored some covers for me, for myself and for my dad, and various little things here and there. And this is her first interiors coloring job. So that was mostly because I wanted to give her an opportunity to sort of try out coloring rather than just flatting. And also I didn't have the time to do the colors myself. And with her, I can sort of tell her what to do more than I would with a professional colorist. I wouldn't want to be like, right, now go and do this, because they obviously have their own thing and they'll have their own ideas. And Pip does too, but it's like I can be a bit more hands-on slightly. So yeah, maybe I just struggle to let go of that stuff. Maybe I probably need to get better at just handing things off.
Well, and also she'd never done that before, so I imagine
Yeah,
to some degree she'd appreciate it. This actually just reminds me of, I don't remember when it was. I've talked to your dad several times over the years, and I remember him telling me one time, I think, like we were talking about having you color the projects, like, because I think your first one for Ed and Sean was My Heroes Have Always Been Junkies, right?
yeah,
Yeah, and like I remember him being like, and one advantage is if I need to like talk about something, I just be like, come over here. and like
yeah,
and like that's an advantage. So it's like you're not the first person to ever do that. But
yeah,
I do think it's kind of funny. So you're talking about how like on most of your projects you're like penciling, inking, coloring, and lettering. It is kind of funny. Your first comic you really did was you self-published Rowboy at the age of 11, which you wrote, drew, colored, and lettered before selling it
yeah.
at Brighton Comic Con. It's kind of funny in a weird way. Besides the writing part, you kind of, I don't want to say you defined what you were going to do then, but in some ways it kind of is like what you were going to do because of that.
Yeah, I think like it was all just one thing to me, like I think forever. And doing like
You're just making comics.
yeah. And before I was even making comics professionally, I was doing illustrate like just freelance illustration. So I was sort of doing either line stuff with color or full painted stuff, but I would be responsible for the entire image. I never would just pencil it or whatever. I would always have to do it, all of it. So it's the same approach that I took when it came to making comics as well. And it was always that always just felt like a natural thing for me. And also when it came to doing Texas Blood, I didn't have the money to pay someone to do any of that stuff. It was all because it's with Image. It was all through you get paid back end.
Right.
So at no point was I like, oh well, I can just spend thousands of dollars on getting a colorist or getting a letterer, and it was never really an option for us. So it was like, oh, I know how to do it, so I'll just do it. I might not be the best either of them. I don't even think I was coloring at that point. I definitely hadn't lettered anything professionally. So I was like, oh, I'll just sort of try it. And I know vaguely what I'm doing. I know
Mm-hmm.
how to work the software. And the rest I can figure out later on. And it was more out of necessity than a choice, really. And then it turned out that I like doing that. I like having the full control over the page, and I like having pretty much everything visual is down to me. Like, I design most of the. My dad actually designed the logo for Texas Blood, but other than that, all the design has been my own stuff. Not on Newburn. Chip obviously designs Newburn. He's a much better designer than I am. But with Texas Blood and Enfield, it's all my own design. So it's like I like having control over all that stuff, and even down to like the Enfield paper stock. We chose to do the newsprint paper on that. Again, that was a specific design choice that we went. We had to go and ask Image if we can do it. So we're like, this will be really cool. Is it possible to do it without spending 3 times the money? And
Good.
luckily, it was.
Good. That's a very
Yeah.
important question to ask before you find out. And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Looking for the right place to read digital comics? You can find it at Omnibus. Omnibus is a modern digital comic book store and reader app carrying your favorite single issues, volumes, and omnibuses all day and date. It's just like a comic shop where you pay per book, but digital. Omnibus has even upped its game lately, adding an iPhone version of the app with Android coming very soon. That gives you more about what you love about Omnibus, but in your pocket. Looking for an ideal digital comic store, but with an excellent shopping and reading experience? One that uses novel discovery features to help fans find their next new favorite book? And one that features many of the best comics and publishers today, including publishers like Image, Boom, Dark Horse, and more? You can find that all on Omnibus. Visit the web store or download the app today at omnibus.app. And now, back to the show. I want to go into your background a little bit just because I mentioned your dad. So you grew up in a house of comics. You grew up with comics around you. You grew up with art around you. Did you want to be a comic artist, or is that something that kind of, I don't want to say just happened, but it was like, did you grow up knowing you wanted to be a comic artist, or was it like, were there other things that interested you as you were coming up, like illustration?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely did just happen. I think, I drew them as a kid and I was always into them, but I grew up seeing how hard it is to do. And it's
Yeah.
so time consuming. Compared to illustration, illustration's got different, problems to overcome, but it's a lot of intense work. And I saw that and I was like, I don't know if that's what I want to be doing.
Yeah.
I could just spend a day on an illustration and get paid for it, and then move on to the next thing, which is a plus and a negative. Illustration I found doesn't have the same stability that comics provides because it's not a monthly gig. It's you do one thing and you're scrambling for the next thing, which comics definitely has, but it's at least, it gives you, maybe 6 months or whatever, a year at a time, not a day at a time. So when it came to like doing my own comics, it was not really a conscious choice. Like I was doing pitches for different writers for, a page rate, assuming nothing would ever come of it. And I took them as illustration jobs, just like, a week's worth of work. I'll do 5 pages or 10 pages. Most of the scripts were terrible. And then I'd turn in the pages and then they'd go and pitch it around to various publishers and nothing would ever come of it. So I did like 4 or 5 of those. And Chris was just, I knew Chris already because he was trying to get a film made of what turned into the first issue of Texas Blood. He was doing a short film of that sequence when he pulls him over with the casserole dish at the end. That was going to be a short film, which hopefully lead into a feature based in that world. So I did some concept art for it because he had seen my illustrations at the back of Kill or Be Killed. I was doing the backup essay illustrations at the time, and he was reading the book. So he just emailed me and said, "Oh, do you want to do this set of illustrations for this film? Try to get some funding for it. I'll pay you however much, and you can do five paintings." And the script was really good. So I was like, "Yeah, this sounds really cool. Like, I'd love to do it." So I did these illustrations and then didn't hear from him for a while. And I think he never really got anywhere with the film. But he'd also worked with Duncan Fegredo on another project. Duncan had done a poster for him for another film that he'd made a couple of years earlier. I know Duncan through my dad, and so we already had a bit of that connection. So I knew he was pretty good. Like the film that he'd made before was pretty good, and I knew it, I liked his stuff. So hadn't heard from him for a while, and he was like, "Oh, it's not really happening, but I love comics. I love writing comics. Do you want to maybe try and do that?" And I was like, "Oh, yeah, sure, okay." So we did a pitch. We did a pitch packet of 10 pages, I think it was, which is mostly the end of that first issue, the casserole dish scene. I think from him waking up, we had a sort of dream sequence, but which we got in the first issue with the sort of zombie guy. We had that, but he couldn't afford to pay me to draw that page. He had enough for 9 pages or whatever, I don't know. But it was just the first page of that pitch was just a 9-panel grid with 9 black panels, apart from the middle one had a really small figure of him walking towards you. But the rest was all just caption boxes. And that was the first page of our pitch, which seems like a ridiculous thing to do in hindsight.
Yeah.
But so again, I just sort of, I'd done a few of them and I assumed nothing would really come of it. And then nothing did for 6 months. And then...
When was this, really quick?
This was 2019.
It was around when you first colored Junkies.
Yeah, it was about the same time.
Okay.
I think maybe it was just before. I think I was probably working on Junkies when we got picked up. Probably.
Okay.
Because we didn't mention in the pitch anything about my dad or anything like that. And then, Eric emails like 6 months later saying, "Oh, if you've not got a home, Image would love it." We're like, "Oh, this is like the best it could possibly have turned out." So I sort of was like, "Oh, now I actually have to draw comics. Like I'm gonna have to actually do it." So yeah, I just sort of fell into it, and I've been doing it since then. That was 2020. Or maybe I think we started it in 2019 and it was meant to come out in 2020. It did, but it was meant to come out earlier. And then lockdown happened and everything got shut down. And we were like, "Oh my God, is it ever going to even come out?" It got pushed and we were like, "Oh no." And we started the Patreon with with a new story, like a new character, a whole new thing. We're like, "Oh, well, if we're not doing that, let's just sort of do something to try and keep some kind of momentum going." And it ended up getting pushed back just 1 month. And we were one of the first books back after the initial shutdown, which I think probably helped quite a lot in the sort of reception of that first issue, because people had nothing to read.
I do think it's interesting that even if you weren't initially considering comics, like it was something you kind of fell into, it seems like art and illustration was always going to be a focus for you. You never had like that inclination of like, your life's not for me, Dad. I'm not going to draw. I'm going to become a marine biologist or something like that. It seems like you were always kind of drawn to art. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, definitely. And my mum's a painter as well. She used to be a graphic designer, and now she's a painter. So it's like...
It's in your blood.
Yeah, definitely. But then my older brother he went off and did physics, and now he writes...
Renegade.
Yeah, he's like, now he works in like software, coding and all that sort of stuff. So it's like, he's like, the weird one in the family that went and got a real job. So it was never like, it was not really, I wouldn't say it was really pushed on us. It was just sort of, always there. And I never stopped doing it. So it was just, and it's just one of those, it's like I was good at it in school. So I carried on doing it, and I enjoy it.
That's good.
Yeah, it was just always there. And it seemed like, I was never sort of like, no, I'm going to go and find my own thing. I just sort of went with it, and it brought me here.
I mean, if you were doing coding, you probably would be up until like midnight or 2 a.m. doing stuff. But I did want to ask about illustration really quick, because I know you did a cover illustration for the Criterion collection of John Sayles' Lone Star, which feels pretty fitting given your comics work. Are you still pursuing illustration work around what you're doing in comics, or are those kind of projects pretty situational and if opportunities arise?
Yeah, definitely the latter. It was like, I love doing the film covers. They're really fun. And I work with a few different companies. I'm doing one at the moment for Fun City Editions, which I've done a few things for. And they're great because it's like, that's what I would sort of do for fun anyway. Like it's basically just making like fan art. I would always do that anyway. And it's like, I get to watch a film that I would never have seen otherwise, never heard of, because they're usually not so much with Lone Star, but a lot of them, the ones for other companies, are much smaller films. Some of them are like straight to TV, things like that are finally getting a Blu-ray release or whatever. And then you get and it's like a couple of days work, and you get a cool, you get sent a cool product at the end with the artwork on it. It's like, oh, this is so cool. So those kind of things I'm not actively pursuing, but it's when they show up in my inbox, I'm like, yes, I'm definitely going to do it. And it's the same with like doing variant covers for the books and stuff like that. I sort of approach it in the same way. As it's a nice little sort of, it feels like a nice break from doing your own stuff. It's like, because comics, obviously, it's like day in, day out, churning out pages, and it can get a bit sort of overwhelming or monotonous or whatever. So it's like, I get one day a week maybe where I'm doing other things, which it's not great when you've got a deadline and you're like, I forgot I've got to do that cover for that thing. And it's like, God, everything's always like last minute, and I'm late on everything, but it's like, it's always a fun sort of distraction from my actual, what I see as like my actual work. This is like fun side work. But yeah, never like actively pursuing it. And I definitely don't have like the same number of clients that I used to do when I was just doing illustration. And I'm not emailing people trying to get more work or anything like that. It's just sort of, there's a few companies now that I have sort of repeat work with, and that's ideal for me, really. Every couple of months I get to do a film.
Well, and I imagine that having that kind of change of pace for you is probably good mentally, because like you said, it's like you can kind of get like, I don't know, you can kind of get lost in the work, and like probably not in a good way. And so having something that like snaps you out of it and forces you to start thinking in a different way probably is actually beneficial for you when you're working on interiors too. Yeah,
it's a nice sort of refresher, and you come back to the comics, I think, with slightly renewed energy and a fresh set of eyes on it. Because otherwise, you're just looking at the same pages over and over. Well, they're not even the same pages. They feel like the same pages.
You're just like, everything gets a red background on this page. Screw it. I'm over it.
Yeah. At points, it's got to... I once, a couple of months ago, I re-inked a page, which I didn't realize that I'd already inked, because I was so like, just sort of in sort of autopilot mode with it, that I was like, this feels familiar, but maybe it's just because I've done this. I'm working on this same scene for a week or whatever. And then I went to scan the page and save it, and it's like, replace file. And I was like, what? I realized that I'd inked that entire page already like a week earlier. and I had no idea.
So there's like the different steps in the process for an artist. Like you're going to be doing like thumbnails or layouts, and then you're going to do penciling, and then you're going to do inking, but you also got coloring and lettering. But we'll focus on the first three for now. I don't know. One of the things I always think is interesting is like how different those spaces are for artists, where it's like layouts. It's like I've talked to people where they're like, I cannot listen to anything with words when I'm doing that because that's like storytelling. And then like inking, you're like, you could do literally anything around me and I would just be so in the zone. It doesn't even matter. Like, do you find that like that thing where it's like repeating the page could only happen with inking because of that, like that Zen state where you're just like, whatever, I'm just doing my thing?
Yeah, definitely. Because it's like, yeah, it's just you can totally just zone out and you're doing it, and especially when it's like, yeah, it's a longer scene, and because I penciled it, I think I'd penciled it a good few weeks earlier, so I wasn't like in that sort of rhythm with it. Normally, I sort of alternate day to day whether I'm inking or penciling. I pencil and I ink those pages the next day. So I think I was a bit out of it. I'd penciled it weeks earlier, and I was sort of inking this scene. I was like, oh, no, doing another page, and then yeah, you sort of get in that zone and it's just putting lines down at that point. Yeah, you're not thinking about the storytelling aspect of it or the composition aspect of it. It's just finishing off the pages, which doesn't sound particularly, it sounds like I don't care, but you're just sort of polishing those pages. So you can get very into the zone with it. So I think, yeah, I was sort of slightly switched off with it. And yeah, when I realized that, but what I've ended up doing is there's panels on each page that I like more than some of them I like more than the other ones. So I've managed to sort of composite the perfect page from various panels on the two attempts.
That's funny. So you actually saw like like significant differences enough where you can like Frankenstein's monster a different page together at the end.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah, maybe it might not be noticeable to other people, but it was on Megalopolis, which I'm working on at the moment, and it's got I'm doing like watercolor washes as well as the inks, which I haven't done before apart from on covers. It can be quite unpredictable. So it's like sometimes it works out really nicely and sometimes it's like, oh, I wish I hadn't just done that. So there's quite a few bits in it where I'm like, I would go back and change that if I could. So it was almost quite nice having a second go at
Oh,
that
so you mean like
pitch.
actual watercolor washes, not like digital watercolor washes?
No, yeah, actual ones.
Okay.
I'm like grayscale.
Yeah.
And then I'm doing yeah, like normal black and white line work with a grayscale wash and then coloring over that.
Okay. That reminds me of one of the people who's has a pull quote on that Texas Blood is Michael Lark. And he told me something about one of his favorite things about inking was like the happy accidents where it's like sometimes something goes wrong in the right way. And you're just like, I actually like this more. This is pretty awesome. It's hard to recreate that digitally. And it's like sometimes like those effects are really nice and you wouldn't get that otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. Like before I started drawing the pages, I went and bought like 5 different types of watercolor, all black, and then just have like a piece of paper with them all on just to see how each one dries. Because I wanted like a really grainy texture, so when it dries, it sort of separates out. Using something like that, yeah, you get really nice effects that you couldn't really. I mean, sure, sure some people can. I can't replicate digitally, and yeah, you get a lot more of those sort of happy accidents, but then you also get some unhappy accidents at the same time.
I have a friend who's an artist who has a kitten, and that kitten recently just went right down a page that he was inking. Thankfully, it was a black cat, so that actually works out. But at the same time, that's a tricky thing. I do want to really quickly note, you mentioned Megalopolis. I think it's very funny. You're working with Chip, or you worked with Chip Zdarsky on Newburn, and he's writing Batman. Very notable person. You work with Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips, your dad, on varying projects, including, was it The Houses of Unholy coming up?
Yeah.
And yet, by far, not your most famous collaborator, because you're working with Francis Ford Coppola, which is just like one of those. I mean, I know Chris Rial is writing it, but at the same time, it's one of those things where it's just like, when I remember seeing that press release and I was just like, what the hell am I reading here? What is this?
I know, yeah. Well, I remember getting the email from Chris saying like, I've got this project and I can't tell you who it is. It's like an award-winning director. I was like, I've got no idea who you're talking about.
It feels like an understatement when you're talking about Francis Ford Coppola.
Yeah. He's like, would you be interested? It's a graphic novel adaptation of a film. And I was like, I mean, yeah, I guess so. But I've got yeah, okay. And then once I'd sort of expressed an interest, he could tell me who it was, and I was like, yeah, I feel like you massively underplayed that first email.
Yeah, I mean, like, award-winning could be like one-time Gotham
Yeah,
award-winning director of this short film, but instead it's like
yeah,
Francis Ford Coppola.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. The director.
Yeah.
It's a really weird gig though, because it's like I've never spoken to Francis,
Hmm.
so it's like I'm just dealing with Chris. It feels like it's like a really cool thing to talk about and tell people about, but I've not actually like
Engaging with
dealt
him.
with him. Yeah, which is a weird space. They're like, oh, it must be so cool. Like, and it's like actually, it's kind of just like doing any other thing, but it's like I have to. But it's like weirder. Like it's just like it's got this weird like nebulous thing. Sort of, it feels like over my shoulder
Hmm.
because I know it's like I think it's going to be a novel as well. It's obviously got the film.
Hmm.
I'm sure he's got something else as well. Like it's a really weird gig, and it's like adapted from the script, not from the actual film. I've not seen the film or anything. I've seen a bit of like concept art for it, but I've not seen. I know Chris has watched the a couple of cuts of it. He's watched the final cut, and he watched a few sort of rough cuts as well earlier on. But I've not seen anything, so it could be completely different to how the film comes out. I kind of hope it is. I hope it's its own thing,
Yeah.
not just a bad version of the film.
I was really hoping Francis was working on I like him calling Francis as if he's my pal or something. I was really hoping he was working on it just so you could be like, no, Francis, you can't have two actions in one panel.
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Yeah.
God, you know movies, you don't know comics. Come on.
Yeah, unfortunately, no contact. I've seen a photo of him holding up like a printout of one of my pages, and that's like the most we've interacted. Maybe afterwards I'll get a nice email or something.
I figured it was going to be kind of like that. I mean, it seems like Megalopolis is a pretty sprawling project, but I do want to talk about your most recent projects. I'm going to do an abbreviated spiel on each really quick. Your most recently completed series is Newburn with Chip Zdarsky at Image, and it was about a mob fixer named Eastern Newburn and his teammate Emily as they negotiate the treacherous world of law, crime, and the intersection and overlap between those ideas. Then there's That Texas Blood and the Enfield Gang Massacre, which were both with your oft collaborator and writer Chris Condon, with That Texas Blood being about the varying investigations by Sheriff Joe Bob Coates and others in his orbit in a very, very cursed Texas county. Just tough times there.
Yeah.
While the latter is a prequel in the same county about a group of outlaws and their showdown against some nefarious crime fighters. And I do mean it that way, that order. That's a lot of crime. To say nothing of your work with Ed and Sean. Let's start there. Are you a crime guy, or is that just kind of how things worked out?
It's kind of just how things worked out. I think maybe, well, when it came to Chip, he emailed me. This is probably 2018, 2019.
Did that precede That Texas Blood?
Yeah, it was. I was sort of just about starting work on Texas Blood when sort of started talking to Chip.
Okay.
So we'd met at TCAF 2017, 2018, something like that. And I'd just gone along with my dad. He had a table there. And we were sat near Chip because we were sort of, that year they had like an image room in a different part of the convention. So I met Chip then, and he came over to the Lakes Festival as well, maybe the following year. So I knew him a little bit, and he's seen my illustration work. And I'd done this pitch with this like Hollywood guy. He was like a showrunner on something that I'd never seen. But he was like, do you want to do this comic and we'll sell it as a TV show? I can give you 3% of the rights and I'll pay you like $100 a page. And I was like, no, that sounds like the worst deal. So, and my dad told Ed. Was like, oh, why are you dealing with this kind of stuff when Chip wants to do a book with you? And I was like, you haven't told me Chip wants to do a book with me. So he was like, oh, right. Hold on. And then like emailed Chip, and then Chip emailed me, and he was like, oh, do you want to do a book together? And I was like, what? Like, okay. And at the time, I don't know if Daredevil had started yet, but I obviously knew him from Sex Criminals and all that stuff. So I was like, this is, yeah, cool. Obviously I want to work together. What's the book? And he was like, oh, I don't know. What do you want to draw? And I was like, probably not like superhero stuff. You know, I'm sort of real world, quieter stuff that I don't have to draw like people in spandex. So he was like, okay, I'll have a think. And then just like 2 weeks later, he emailed me and said, oh, I've got this idea. It sort of came from, yeah, I want to draw like real world stuff. And he was like, okay, I've got this crime idea. It wasn't like I want to draw crime.
Right.
That's what I'm into. And the same with Texas Blood. It was just sort of like it just happened to be the story that Chris had that he wanted to tell. And I like drawing that stuff. I like the quieter stuff. I like sort of the character driven moments, and I like doing sort of character acting stuff, and I think that suits that sort of crime world quite well. So I think it's just sort of worked out quite nicely. The crime stuff itself isn't necessarily the bit that interests me in it. It's the character driven stories that's the sort of interest for me.
I do think it's funny that when you think about it, what you're talking about smaller human stories that are character driven. And in terms of mainstream Western direct market comics, there's very few ones that are going to give you that without like sci-fi elements or horror elements or like spandex without being crime in a lot of ways, because it needs some sort of genre trappings. And like the funny thing is because of your interest in, I'm not saying that this is your forever home, but it does seem like you almost kind of have to have like a natural lean into crime unless you want to get into horror or something like that.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, that's one of the funny things. I guess your dad's kind of had that experience too outside of his superhero stuff. Not that he's like, come on, Ed, can't we do like a My Little Pony story or something like that?
Yeah.
Although he'd kill it. It'd be really weird, but I would love to see it.
The reason they ended up doing Junkies is because he
wanted to do a love story.
To do like a romance comic.
Yeah.
So it is like, you need some kind of like way in, like with it. Yeah, I don't know. It is weird, isn't it? I think it's like, also, I guess it's quite hard to sell a story that's just sort of, it's like the literary fiction equivalent in comics. It's like,
I know you're a fan of Adrian Tomina, and like Adrian Tomina is like funny. I mean, I love his stuff, and he did Optic Nerve, which was sold as single issues for a long time. But that's not something you're going to really see very often in terms of like, if that was a single issue comic, or if like The Loneliness of the Long Distance Cartoonist came out in single issues, people would be like, what the hell is this?
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, it's like the only way you can tell the stories that are purely human and don't have those genre trappings would be to go to the book market and to operate in a different space in a lot of ways.
Yeah. That's the stuff that, like, when I was a kid, I grew up reading, the stacks of DC comics that my dad got every month from, when he got like a comp of everything they brought out that month back then. But when I got back into comics, like sort of later on in my teens, it was very much that world that I was reading, and like Love and Rockets and stuff like that. Like, I love all the stuff after the Rockets end. It's like all that stuff. And like Dan Clowes and that kind of thing. And it's like, that's very much like what got me back into comics, but it's very hard to carve out a space there, I think. And you need to operate in a completely different kind of market to what the direct market wants. So I think it's sort of, that is the stuff that interests me, and it's trying to find a way to get that into like a compelling monthly read, which I think with Chip and with Chris, I think they're both really good at that stuff. So it's just happened to match up so well, which is like why I'm still working with Chris, and like we've just finished Enfield. We'll be going back to Texas Blood eventually, and we're working on something new starting in a couple of months, which is going to be a separate new title, because I like the way that he does his character stuff. That's what draws me in. It's like, obviously, I'm interested in what the story is going to be, but it's like, I'm happy just to work with him because I know that he'll do that stuff, and that's what I want to draw. It just matches nicely.
Yeah. I mean, my favorite part about Newburn in particular was, as much as I loved like the crime stuff, I loved Easton. Again, it's like Francis, best friends, me, Easton, and Francis. I loved his relationship with Emily, and just like, I don't know, that's part of the spoilers for the finale, but that was part of the reason why probably my favorite part in the entire series, besides I love the background issue on Newburn, but I loved in the finale that you got that moment where you get to see him after, like, after he's through it. And like, I don't know, there's like getting to see him with a beard and like with a smile. Like, I don't know what was weirder, seeing him with a beard or with a smile.
I know, it was really hard to make him look like him in that first panel, because he's got a beard and he's smiling. It's like, it doesn't look, there's nothing about him right now that looks like the character that I've been with.
I actually was flipping back and forth just to compare. Like, I think I grabbed another issue and I was just like, whoa, this is crazy. Like, he looks like a completely different person.
I know. Well, when I inked it, so Pip flats all that stuff for me, and she was like, "Who's this guy at the end?" I was like, she doesn't read them when they're out, but she's obviously been flatting it for almost the entire series. And I was like, "What do you mean? It's Newburn?" And she was like, "Oh." I was like, what did you think was happening? Like, why would she just go and see? Like, she was like, "I thought it was just like an Italian guy." What? Like, oh, it's good to see that my storytelling comes across.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Zoop is the new home for creator-owned crowdfunding, and they are doing some exciting new things in the space. Be sure to join the Horde of Vault Comics crowd-building campaign. Barbaric Born in Blood #1 is free to all who sign up, and the more fans who sign up, the more items get unlocked for everyone. Also, if you ever want to own a piece of Zoop, now you can. They're running an equity crowdfunding campaign where your contribution will get you shares in the company, as well as other perks. Visit republic.com/Zoop to support and become an investor in Zoop. Stay tuned for more exciting announcements about new features and new projects such as the upcoming campaigns from the likes of Adriana Mello, Christian Ward, and the live campaigns by Paul Cornell, Chris Weston, and more. For creators looking to crowdfund your project, Zoop is currently open for submissions. Email them at hello@wearezoop.com to start a campaign. And now, back to the show. No, I mean, it does. It's just like seeing me with 5 arms. Seeing Newburn smile is just like irregular. Anyways, one of the things I think is funny about this is like you walking through the history of like these books. So like Newburn starting 2018-ish, let's say then, like the relationship that leads to Newburn. And then like that Texas Blood starting somewhere around there. Before we even really, frankly, besides like people who are reading the back matter of Kill or Be Killed, a lot of people didn't know who you were. And yet you were working on all the projects that kind of come to be in the last 3 or 4 years. And the funny thing about that is like, there's 2 things about that. One, it's like you kind of appear on the scene and you got like a billion projects going on at once. And then 2, it also looks like you're drawing like 3 things at once, basically. And it seems, I mean, I'm sure you were at times drawing 2 books at once, but it seems like to some degree the answer to how did you do all of that was you had maybe a little bit more lead time than we expected.
Yeah, like especially at the start, it was very much like, and that's the reason that Texas Blood has usually a hiatus in between arcs, is that I do 6 months work on that and then I go and do 6 months work on Newburn. And again with Newburn we had I think almost a year off maybe even more than that in between the 2 arcs, and that's because I'm spending that time drawing it or drawing something else.
There's also like the diary pages for Emily in there, and it's also like a slightly shorter page count with the backups and everything, if I remember. Well, yeah, and so like that I remember Chip telling me something like, I'll make it shorter so you can like, this will be tolerable amount of pain for you.
Yeah. So it was, I think when we started it, I don't think Chip realized that I was doing Texas Blood as an ongoing. I think he was like, "Oh, you've got like a few issues of that, and then you can do this. But I'll make it short so you can do your coloring as well and all that stuff." And I was like, "Okay, cool, I can do that." And then obviously Texas Blood kept coming out, and he was like, "Oh, are you still drawing this?" And I was like, yeah. He's like, how are you doing this? I'm so glad though, because there's no way I would have managed to do like 2 full length things at once, which it did end up being a lot more overlap than I intended towards the end. And then right at the end, I was doing Megalopolis on top of those, very slowly, but it was still like any sort of gap in the day would be filled with that. So it was way too much. I wouldn't do it again.
Well, you say that, but you also just said that Texas Blood is coming back and you have another project coming with Chris. So that does paint a complicated picture.
Texas Blood will be a little while, I think, still. I think it'll be next year before we see any more from that. Again, I think it's going to end up being... So I finished Megalopolis hopefully in May, end of May. And then I'm going to have a whole month off where I don't do anything. And then I'm starting the new project in July. And then hopefully it's going to be 6 months on that, 6 months on Texas Blood, 6 months on that, 6 months on Texas Blood.
Okay.
For the foreseeable. But actually, I do have another project.
Of course you do.
But it's just like a 4 issue thing. It's like
just some light work.
Thing. Yeah. But that's with another writer, and they're fully aware that I'm just I'll be doing that on the back burner.
Yeah.
And with the new project, because we're working nice and far in advance, I have a lot more lead time, and it's like more like a 6-7 week schedule rather than a 4-week schedule. So it's, it might be doable, but I think, yeah, I'll say, yeah, I'm not doing that again. And then I'll end up somehow with like 4 books on the go. Like, oh, no.
You'll figure it out. I hope your month off is just you actually going into your office and then just playing your game system. Like, that's it.
Yeah.
You're just like, I'm just going to sit around and do whatever I feel like.
Yeah. I think my plan is I want to do some actual painting. That's the aim. Because I used to do like portraits of, get my friends in and sit for portraits for me on like a Saturday afternoon or whatever. And then I got a lot busier with actual work and I've not done it in years. So I'm like, maybe I'll try and do some nice relaxing painting. So it's still kind of work, keeping my eye in.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I talked to your dad for a feature I did last year on Lake Como Comic Art Festival. And like one of the things that he talked about was like the pace of that convention was so slow and he was doing so few commissions. So for listeners that don't know, Lake Como Comic Art Festival is at Lake Como in Italy. And there's typically a very, very low ratio of attendees to actual guest artists. It's like, I think last year it was like 4-1, 4 attendees for every artist. So it's like 400 people went and there's like 100 artists. And he had only like 5 commissions to do over the weekend. So all he did was paintings. And like, I do think, it's kind of like going back to like doing the illustration work where it's like, where you're doing something for like Lone Star. I imagine doing things for yourself as an artist is a nice change of pace where you're able to do something, you want to do because you want to do, not because you're getting paid for it, not because you have like 15 looming deadlines over you.
Yeah, it's a completely different thing. And I think it's also nice to be able to work on something that isn't going to be published and it's not going to be seen. So it takes that pressure off. I can just sort of play around with it and it doesn't have to be good. It can just be for fun. Like when I was doing these portraits a couple of years ago, I had one of my parents' friends' sons. So like, someone that I knew as a kid, but I hadn't not really seen in years. He came and sat for me because his mum wanted him to, but the painting wasn't very good. I ended up scrapping the painting and never finished it. But his mum was like, "Oh, I'll pay you to finish it as a commission." And I was like, "No, because that's just the opposite of what this is about. Like, I don't want it to be a job. It's meant to be for me." So I ended up just not taking her up on the offer because I was like, "No, I don't want to mix those two things. I want to keep it separate. And I want it to be just like a hobby that I do. I don't want it to have to be like a side hustle.
It's for you."
I don't want to fall into that everything. Because also I think, like in sort of the current landscape of things, people have a necessity to sort of monetize a lot of things, but people also feel like everything has to be that. I want to have something that isn't that. I already have enough spinning plates as it is for work. I want it to just be like for me. And I think it's important to have that separation, which again is like, it sort of goes back to having, a separate space for my studio, is that I want to keep work, and I want to keep everything else separate. I don't want to blur those lines as much as I possibly can.
I totally get that. And now an ad break. Just kidding. I mean, it's interesting because it's like sometimes getting paid for these things is necessary because it makes it feel like worth all the time you're putting in. But then at the same time, it's like in a lot of ways it changes it. And like that's kind of tricky. But I did want to ask about like just a few more questions. One of the things I think is interesting is like, you're talking about how you want to have people sit for you. And then I don't know this to be true, but I assume this is to be true. You do use photo reference pretty, like that's a part of your process.
Yeah.
It feels like reality, and maybe that's part of the reason why you're attracted to the types of stories you are, is like reality is a part of your creative process. How do you use photo reference in particular? Do you have like specific rules for how you do or don't use it? Or is it really like, I bust this out when I have a pose or a situation I can't quite figure out myself?
No, I use it for everything. But every figure is either, if I can't find like direct reference or something online, which is most things, but like a crowd scene, I can usually find like a good photo of a crowd and I'll just use that.
You photograph yourself?
Yeah, mostly it's just myself.
Yeah.
Like I don't bother getting any like models or anything like that. And it does mean that every character looks a little bit like me and they've all got like short legs. I don't think I can sort of do it from my head convincingly enough. And it's especially when it comes to like the sort of character acting stuff, it's the little things I think that sell it. And I think it's hard to fake that from nothing unless you're really good. So I think like a lot of my stuff sort of depends on that sort of extra touch of the of reality within it. It also means that I can go as fast as I can. Otherwise, I spend so much time trying to make things right from my head.
Right.
Whereas this, I'm like, I can see what it is, and I can draw that. Even if I'm obviously altering it for the different characters, but it's the basic look is there. So I'm like, okay, I know what I'm doing. I'm not trying to come up with it out of my head. So it cuts out a whole step that would take so much time. And I think it's just, for me, it's just another tool to tell the story. I don't really care about like whether or not it's considered, whether it's cheating or not. It's just like I'm telling the story in the best way that I can, and that's the most important part of it, rather than the sort of that. I think the storytelling for me is more important than the sort of polish of the image as well. So it's sort of whatever tools I can use to tell the story, I'll take full advantage of.
I think people have an overly simplified view of what photo reference is, and they don't necessarily understand how it's used. Some people just look at it as tracing, and it's not necessarily that. It's really just like a real rubric to bump up against to make sure you're getting things right and trying to make sure it seems authentic, and it isn't like something that is physically impossible for you to do in a story that's very much based in reality. And I don't know. I think that's really interesting. But, one thing I wanted to ask about, this is specific for that Texas Blood, but I mean, this is true of everything you do. In issue number 8, there was this particular, I mean, it's throughout this entire arc and all the flashback related ones, but in that issue, you had much brighter color and a cleaner line for the present day story, and then like flatter feeling colors and like a heavier inking line in the flashbacks. When it comes to your approach to any of your projects, like what's your thought process for figuring out the right solution for new stories or new arcs or new projects altogether?
Usually it comes back to the storytelling aspect of it. So it's like with that, when we've got we're cutting back between the two times, I wanted it to be clear to the reader immediately where you are in time. So it's like you can open a page and it's all like the first page of the issue, you know where you are.
I just look at Joe Bob's face.
Yeah. So I needed a sort of visual cue, and I was like, okay, how can I do that? So I've been drawing it digitally. So I was like, okay, so all the 80s stuff I'll draw traditionally as if it was, so then it's sort of like as if it was drawn in the 80s. And also it was like a nice, again, change of pace for me. I've been drawing it sat at my computer for the last year doing the first arc. It'd be nice to draw on some real paper for a change. And then so that was the reason I did that. And then again with the color, it was again just to have a distinct separation. And then with the third arc of Texas Blood, it wasn't quite as thought out as that. That one came down to I drew it digitally because I hadn't bought any new pens and I had to start inking it that day. So it can be anything. Like it worked out in the end, and I with that arc I wanted it to feel kind of grainy, almost as if you're watching it on VHS. It has that sort of like textured grain to it. So working digitally worked quite nicely for that, because I could use sort of like these brushes that I wanted it to look almost as if it had been photocopied like twice, but without losing the definition of the actual drawing, but that sort of feel of it, which digital lends itself to quite nicely because you can add that sort of grain to things. So each time I try and think of it in terms of like what would be a cool nod to the story that we're telling. And then like with Enfield, I just finished reading, I can't remember if it's the first or second book of Human Target. So obviously I want to draw like Greg Smallwood. So I was like, okay, I'm going to try and do this sort of like mid-century sort of pencil look, but I'll do it digitally. And then I did a page and I was like, this is terrible. Because it just looked like a bad version of Greg's work.
Sure.
And it was so clearly just aping that. I was like, this doesn't even make any sense, because it's like, this isn't a mid-century book.
Well, it is, but it's just the wrong century.
Yeah. So I was like, okay, so what am I doing here? So I was like, okay, it makes sense to do it traditionally. Also, I've just come off the back of doing that digital arc, so it's like, it'd be a nice change again. So part of it's keeping it interesting for me, and part of it is what suits the story.
And also whether or not you have pens.
And whether or not I have pens. Yeah. There's so many factors.
I think that is awesome. I know that some people might be like, that is strange. But at the same time, it's just like, sometimes it just comes down to practicality, right? It's like you have to do what the right answer in the right moment is. And it's like, if you got to get to work and you don't have the right pens, it's like, digital is a great option. That sometimes is, situation, timing, all kinds of factors work into why you do things the way that you do. It isn't always like these like poetic thoughts about art. Sometimes it's just like, I got to get stuff done.
Yeah. And sometimes, yeah, it's just like, what have I just done? Let's do the opposite of that. Because I was, yeah, I'd just done most of Texas Blood is digital. But then when I started drawing Newburn, I was like, oh, well, I'll do that traditional because I'm doing Texas Blood digital. So it's just to have the opposite.
Is that because you're fighting boredom?
Yeah, pretty much. It's just like, yeah, trying to keep it interesting for myself and trying to think of how I'm going to approach this upcoming project. And I was like, oh, and I just got, you can see, no one else can see, but that is the artist edition of Sin City.
Mm.
And I got that recently and it's massive. And I was like, oh, this is great. Like maybe if I drew, huge, I'll get sort of denser looking artwork in the final thing. So now I'm thinking maybe I'll try and do that for the next project, which I know my dad did for Night Fever. He drew it on two things, but he had to deal with having that horizontal divide halfway down the page so that he could have it on two separate pieces. So now I'm thinking, oh, do I ink it traditionally, but I pencil it digitally, print it out on two pieces, and then lightbox it onto one huge piece of paper. So it's like I don't know if that will work practically yet, or what I'll do with these huge pages to store them or send them to my art dealer. Just fold them in half, probably. So it's like, things like that. It's like, how can I approach this project differently to how I approached the last one, and constantly evolve in some way and try. Even if it doesn't work, it's like at least I can try and do it, and if I don't like it, I won't do it again. Otherwise, everything will just look the same, and I don't want to just sort of stay where I am.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of interesting to think about that through the prism of the covers you do too, because it's like Enfield Gang Massacre has a very like painterly look, but it's also connected covers. And then Newburn, like you mentioned, Chip designing that, but like the thing that's interesting about those, I love those covers, and I love how integrated your art is with the design, so it feels like strikingly different than the other covers you do. Do you try to do the same thing with your cover work, where you're trying to like really differentiate from project to project?
Yeah, definitely. Again, it's just mostly just like, how can I keep it exciting for myself? Like with the connecting Enfield covers, I thought of that idea before I even read a script, before Chris had even started writing the script. So I said to him like, oh, could we have it so there's like 6 members of the gang and each one will be on the cover? And he was like, oh, maybe, and didn't do that. So I had to, like,
you're like, whatever, I'm just taking random people from the background and put them on here.
Pretty much. It's like, I didn't have a plan. So also in my head, I was like, oh, I'll do it all as one big painting. I'll do all of them at the start. And then again, ran out of time. So I did the first one, and then I did the next one the next month, and the next one the next month. But I hadn't planned out who was on them yet. So it's like, sometimes you've got like an arm going off or coming in, and like, right, whose arm is that going to be on that next cover?
That's future Jacob's problem.
Yeah, exactly. I do that a lot. Just like, I'll deal with that in a month's time. But that was fun to do. I made it much harder for myself because I then have to line them all up afterwards. So like, and match the colors in the paint as well, because it's real paint. And it's, some of it's straight out the tube. So I was like, the sky is just one color straight out the tube.
Oh wait, so you did it all traditionally, and you were still?
Yeah.
Oh my god!
Yeah.
I mean, when I was thinking digitally, I was like, oh, that wouldn't be that hard. But like traditionally is.
Yeah, so it's digitally penciled, so I could line everything up.
Okay.
But all the color matching. But then when I printed and scanned it, it all sort of comes out of line a little bit. Like on the last issue, I penciled it I have the logo on the page, and I penciled it, and I was like, this all works. Printed it out, painted it, scanned it, and the logo covered his face. And I was like, how have I done this? I'd completely misjudged something. So that's why on the last issue, the logo is like in a different place on the cover, because it didn't go where it was meant to go.
That is amazing.
So, I'm constantly fixing issues that I've made for myself.
I mean, comics, it's a magical thing. Sometimes it's problem solving in the moment. Sometimes it's just reacting. I love that stuff. But to close, I want to ask about, I mean, we know you have a lot of projects coming. You have any number of them that are happening 6 months on, 6 months off. Francis Ford Coppola is involved, yada, yada, yada. But you're at a point where you probably have more options than you ever have in comics, and probably in illustration to some degree as well. You also have your coloring gigs with Ed and Sean. Going forward, like, what do you see as an ideal mix for you? Do you see yourself wanting to keep comics as your focus, or could that shift depending on the moment?
I think I'm in comics for the long haul now. I don't know whether I'll keep up the pace in after the next few years. I know I'm locked in for like the next 2 years of doing a lot of stuff, but after that, maybe it'd be nice to slow down, but then something will come up and I'll say yes. and it'll be another year. Also, I've got to pay bills. So it's
Yes.
like a lot of it is, I'd love to take 6 months off, but it's like, well, I don't make any money then for 6 months. So yeah, I think my plan is at the moment just keep making comics. And I'm, even though I didn't mean to get into it, I'm loving doing it now. And I get more out of it, I think, than I would if I was just doing illustration stuff. And I get to make my own thing with people that I choose to make them with. It's not like I work, I don't do any sort of work for hire stuff really, apart from the odd thing here and there. That might change if I get offered a cool job, but it's like at the moment I'm just making stuff I want to make with my friends pretty much. It's like, it's what I can't think of a better situation really than what I'm doing. So I don't think I'll be changing anytime soon.
Yeah. That makes sense. You got to convince, you got to just talk to Ed and Sean about, like, what if we did a swaparoo for one graphic novel? Like, I'll draw it, my dad will color it. Have you guys thought about that yet?
I'm not sure my dad will be very pleased with that.
He's like, come on, man. This is my job. What are you doing here? Well, I know you have plenty coming up, and I'm excited to read all of it, but that is all I have for you, Jacob. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about your career, Newburn, that Texas Blood, and everything else. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with artist and colorist Jacob Phillips. You can find his work in Newburn, That Texas Blood, and the Enfield Gang Massacre. Big thanks to Deanna Chapman for stepping in to edit this week's episode. If it sounds better than usual, it's because of her. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at @sketchcomic or following me at @slicefriedgold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including John Auerbach, Dustin Weaver, Ninja Assassin Love Story webcomic, Brandon Heyman, John Neesmith, Aiden Hammond, Kenny Myers, JKJ Art, Faith Aaron Hicks, Yeah Comics, Ben Rowe, Cameron Brown, Jonathan Breen, Danny Ollie, Charlie Stickney, Tom Drennan, Jeremy Thomas Burke, Jared Schwab, Scott Dunn, Chip Mosher, Seth Pomeroy, James McEwen, Andrew Lehman, Christina Merkler, Scott Place, Travis Gibb, Darcy Van Polgees, Travis Schmeiser, Tom Evans, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sudaconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian Holk, Nira Levy, Jason Hussa, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Django Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Beachy, Ben Domstead, Rom V, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Oren, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Vandeven, Submed Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Choi, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Bauer, Declan Shalvey, Dan Carino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Liana Kangas, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Susanna Pullo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Carita, Stefan Holb, Philip Myrick, Chris Pachal, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Ayala, Achilles, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Nick Polito, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendrick, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Odd Panel's outro and ad music just for the show. Check out both their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.